It was 5 in the morning when I jolted awake, not just from sound, but from light. A harsh yellow strobe flashed across my bedroom walls in steady pulses, cutting through the darkness like a warning signal. The entire house vibrated as heavy equipment reversed just feet from my window. Beep, beep, beep. Each vibration traveled up through the floor and into my chest. Then came the sound that made my stomach drop. Metal scraping against ice, a deep, grinding drag. And finally, a heavy impact. Not a soft dump, but the kind of solid thud you feel in your bones, like concrete hitting frozen ground. I pulled back the curtain and saw an HOA-contracted loader outside, its rotating amber lights reflecting wildly off the snowbanks and into my room. The bucket lifted again and tipped forward, unloading massive slabs of compacted snow directly into the storm drain that ran beside my property. Not near it. Not alongside it. Straight into it. I ran outside in my boots, yelling for them to stop. The driver barely looked at me. He tapped his clipboard and said, "HOA order. This is where they told us to dump it." In that moment, I knew exactly how this would end. That drain was the only thing stopping spring melt from rushing downhill into my yard and 3 other homes. I had warned the HOA about this exact risk before. In writing, they ignored every warning. And when everything failed, they blamed me. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a quiet subdivision just outside Maple Ridge, Idaho, the kind of place where winters shape how everything works. The roads curve with the hills, pine trees line the lots, and snow isn't a seasonal inconvenience, it's a structural reality. People here usually mind their own business. You shovel, you wave, you move on. That was exactly how I lived, until the HOA decided appearances mattered more than physics. The neighborhood was built on a gradual slope that doesn't look dangerous at first glance. But when snow melts, gravity does exactly what it's supposed to do. All that water moves downhill, fast. That's why, before the first house ever went up, engineers designed a reinforced drainage channel that runs along the edge of my property. It's not decorative landscaping. It's not optional. It's a required runoff system meant to protect every home below it from flooding once winter breaks. I understood that better than most because I spent over 15 years working in civil maintenance. I've seen what happens when drainage systems are ignored or compromised. Meltwater builds hydrostatic pressure. It looks harmless at first, a slow creep, a softening of the ground, but once pressure finds resistance, it looks for another path. And when it does, it doesn't ask permission. It goes through walls, foundations, and anything else in its way. That's why I noticed the problem early. Storm after storm, the snow piles near the drainage channel grew larger, not just taller, but denser. Each time the HOA's contractor pushed snow toward the same area, heavy equipment compacted it further. Snow like that doesn't stay snow for long. Through the freeze-thaw cycle, it turns into layered ice, air squeezed out, hardened until it's nearly as solid as concrete. Once that happens, water can't pass through it. It only builds up behind it. I warned the HOA as soon as I saw that happening. The HOA board leader, Linda Carver, didn't appreciate those warnings. Linda cared deeply about order and appearance. She liked straight lines, neat piles, and uniformity. She talked endlessly about curb appeal and property values, but never about runoff, pressure, or what happens when systems designed for safety are blocked for convenience. Every time I brought up the drainage channel, her expression changed. Not confused, annoyed, like I was complicating something she considered settled. That winter was one of the worst Maple Ridge had seen in years. Snow fell early and didn't stop. Plowbanks along the roads climbed higher than fences. Instead of hiring a specialized snow management company, the HOA went with the cheapest bid. The contractor worked fast and followed instructions without question. Snow went wherever the board told them to put it. After one particularly heavy storm, I sent Linda an email explaining exactly what was happening. I included diagrams of the slope. I explained how compaction would turn the pile into an ice dam. I warned her that once temperatures rose, meltwater would have nowhere to go except sideways. She didn't reply. Another storm hit a week later, worse than the last. The piles crept closer to the drain, pressing right up against it. This time I emailed again, more direct, spelling out the risk in plain language. I referenced county requirements and reminded her that the channel was a restricted zone. Hours later, her reply came back. One sentence. The board has approved the plan. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about misunderstanding. They weren't unaware. They had decided efficiency and appearance mattered more than safety. By late winter, the piles were enormous, layered, compacted, frozen solid. Then the weather shifted. Daytime temperatures rose just enough to start the melt, while nights stayed cold enough to refreeze everything underneath. Perfect conditions for pressure to build. At first, it showed up as small things, water pooling where it never had before, soil that felt spongy underfoot. The drainage channel stayed silent, clogged tight behind the ice wall. Then it accelerated. My backyard turned into a shallow lake almost overnight. Water crept toward my foundation, slow but relentless. Two neighbors downhill weren't as lucky. Their basements flooded first, water pouring in through window wells and seams in the concrete. I was still trying to coordinate a fix when the HOA acted, not with help, but with blame. A violation notice arrived claiming my landscaping had redirected runoff and caused the flooding. It demanded corrective action and hinted at fines if I didn't comply. Standing there, reading that notice while water still pooled in my yard, something clicked into place. This wasn't ignorance anymore. It was a reckless choice, followed by an even more reckless attempt to avoid responsibility. The HOA didn't pause or reconsider once the flooding started. They escalated. Within days, another notice arrived, this one colder and more formal, accusing me of unauthorized drainage modification. According to the board, something I had done on my own property had redirected runoff and caused the damage downhill. The letter listed a fine, a compliance deadline, and a reminder that continued violations could result in a lien. I read it standing in my kitchen, shoes still muddy, listening to water drip somewhere below the floorboards. No inspection, no questions. No questions. No acknowledgement of the warnings I had sent. They had decided on a story, and they were sticking to it. Worse than the fine was what followed. Neighbors started acting differently. Conversations stopped when I walked by. One couple caught me on the sidewalk and asked, carefully, why I had changed the drainage. Another said the board told them my landscaping was out of compliance and had pushed water into their basement. The HOA wasn't just blaming me on paper, they were spreading it. I asked for an emergency meeting that same afternoon. I explained the urgency, the ongoing damage, and the need to clear the drain immediately. Linda replied hours later with a short message saying there was no need for a special meeting and that the matter would be handled internally. That was it. No timeline, no inspection, no plan. So I sent evidence. Photos taken before and after storms showing snow packed tight against the drainage channel. County diagrams highlighting the runoff path. Copies of my earlier emails warning exactly what would happen if the drain was blocked. I laid it all out, hoping facts would finally break through. The board didn't respond, not even to acknowledge receipt. A few nights later, the weather turned from bad to dangerous. Warm rain fell steadily, just enough to melt the top layer of snow while leaving the compacted ice underneath intact. The freeze-thaw cycle kicked into overdrive. Meltwater built up behind the blockage, pressure rising with nowhere to go. I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in a neighborhood. A deep crack followed by a rushing roar, like water being forced through a narrow gap at full speed. The drain had failed. The backed-up water surged sideways, slamming into my retaining wall. Under hydrostatic pressure, the weakest point gave way. A section collapsed, and muddy water poured forward. By the time I reached the basement, it was already coming in through the window wells, spilling across the concrete floor in a fast-spreading sheet. Outside, it was worse. 2 downhill homes took on water almost immediately. One family lost a sealed storage bin filled with decades-old wedding photos, the kind printed long before digital backups were common. The water soaked them through before anyone could react. Another neighbor's basement flooded high enough to warp a child's first crib they had kept carefully stored, waiting for the day they might need it again. Emergency crews came through. Insurance adjusters followed. Everyone asked the same question: why hadn't the drain been cleared? 2 days later, the HOA answered, through their attorney. The letter accused me of negligence. It claimed I had failed to maintain proper drainage on my property and was therefore responsible for the damage to my home and others. It warned me not to interfere with HOA operations and instructed that all future communication go through their legal counsel. That letter changed everything. Up until then, I had been angry and frustrated, but still hoping common sense would win. That hope ended the moment I read those words. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to protect themselves, even if it meant sacrificing a homeowner who had warned them from the start. I stopped arguing emotionally and started documenting methodically. I created folders and timelines. Every email I had sent, every response they had given, every invoice from the snow contractor. Photos and videos showing snow placement over time. Dates, times, names. I requested records formally and saved everything in multiple places. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was hauling waterlogged boxes out of my basement, a neighbor from farther up the street walked over quietly. He looked around first, then handed me a folded piece of paper. He said he had served on an HOA committee years ago and recognized the pattern. It was a copy of the HOA's snow removal map. The drainage channel along my property was clearly marked as a restricted zone. No dumping, no stacking, no exceptions. At the bottom of the page was a signature approving the plan. Linda's. I stood there staring at that paper, the reality settling in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't poor communication. They had a map. They had rules. They had been warned. And they had ordered the snow dumped there anyway. Then they blamed me for the consequences. That was the moment frustration turned into resolve. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was proving intent. And once intent is documented, the truth has a way of forcing its way to the surface. After seeing that map, I knew opinions, emails, and explanations were no longer enough. I needed something the HOA couldn't talk over, ignore, or twist. I needed proof that stood on its own. The kind that didn't care who Linda was or how confident she sounded in meetings. So the next morning, I hired a licensed civil engineer. He arrived early, boots on, clipboard under his arm, and spent hours on my property without rushing a thing. He measured elevations along the slope. He examined the collapsed section of my retaining wall. He chipped away at the ice still packed inside the drainage channel, shaking his head as he worked. He barely spoke, which somehow made it worse. Silence from a professional usually means the answer isn't going to be gentle. When his report came back, it was brutal. There was no ambiguity, no shared responsibility, no polite language meant to soften the blow. The report stated clearly that the drainage failure was caused by deliberate snow compaction placed directly into a required runoff channel. It explained how repeated freeze-thaw cycles had turned the snow into a solid ice mass, how meltwater built hydrostatic pressure behind it, and how that pressure was forced sideways once the channel was blocked. The collapse of my retaining wall and the flooding of multiple homes were described as foreseeable outcomes. Not possible outcomes, foreseeable ones. Reading that report felt like finally having someone translate months of ignored warnings into language the HOA couldn't dismiss. But I wasn't done. I contacted the county. A few days later, a county inspector showed up wearing a heavy jacket and carrying a tablet. The moment he saw the drainage channel, he stopped walking and nodded slowly, like someone recognizing an old problem. "This drain matters," he said. "It protects everything below it." He took photos, reviewed the engineer's report, and walked the entire length of the channel. Then he asked a single question that made my pulse spike. "Who authorized dumping snow here?" When I told him it was the HOA and gave him Linda's name, his expression changed immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't question it. He pulled up documents on his tablet and turned the screen toward me. They were county environmental runoff regulations tied specifically to hillside developments like ours. Regulations that required clear drainage channels, seasonal inspections, and strict restrictions on snow placement. Violations weren't treated as minor maintenance issues. They carried real penalties. Blocking that drain wasn't just careless. It was a violation. That meant fines. Escalating ones. And those fines didn't disappear just because the HOA wanted someone else to blame. The inspection notice arrived a few days later. It cited the HOA directly. It referenced the engineer's findings. It ordered immediate remediation and warned that failure to comply would result in additional penalties. I forwarded the notice to the HOA board without adding a single word. Linda replied less than an hour later. "Our attorney will handle this." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They weren't backing down. They weren't correcting course. They were doubling down again, this time behind legal language. So I did the same. That afternoon, I contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and property damage. During our first meeting, I laid everything out: the emails, the photos, the snow removal map, the engineer's report, and the county violation notice. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "They didn't just make a bad decision, they documented it." From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. Communication went through council. Record requests became formal. Deadlines were enforced. The HOA was suddenly required to answer questions they had avoided for months. Contractors grew cautious. Insurance adjusters started asking harder questions. Neighbors who had believed the HOA's version of events began to realize they'd been misled. Linda still sounded confident in emails, but it felt different now. Shorter replies, less attitude, more legal phrasing. The authority she relied on was shrinking, replaced by something she couldn't control. Facts. What started as a simple warning about snow placement had turned into documented negligence under county scrutiny. And for the first time since this began, the HOA wasn't talking over me anymore. They were reacting. And that meant the turning point had already passed. Once my attorney started pulling records, the story the HOA had been telling began to collapse almost immediately. What we found wasn't a single bad call made under pressure. It was a pattern. A quiet one, the kind that only shows up when someone finally looks closely enough. Through formal requests and subpoenas, we obtained maintenance logs, inspection schedules, and internal board communications going back several years. The first thing that stood out was what wasn't there. Seasonal drainage inspections were required under both county guidelines and the HOA's own bylaws. They weren't optional, and they weren't new. Yet for 3 consecutive years, there were no completed inspection reports. The records simply stopped. No explanations, no waivers, no follow-up. The second discovery was even worse. To cut costs, the board had approved changes to snow removal procedures that reduced contractor time and fuel use. Fewer dump locations, shorter haul distances, less oversight. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, It meant snow was being redirected into areas that were never meant to handle it, including the drainage channel along my property. And buried in those emails was something else. Strategy. The board wasn't just ignoring risk, they were actively discussing how to handle the fallout if something went wrong. Multiple messages talked about homeowner responsibility, landscaping issues, and non-compliance narratives. It was clear they intended to blame residents long before any flooding occurred. With that evidence in hand, we filed suit. The claims were serious but straightforward: property damage, negligence, and retaliation. The negligence claim addressed the blocked drain, skipped inspections, and violations of county regulations. The retaliation claim covered the fines, the violation notices, and the attempt to publicly frame me after I raised legitimate safety concerns. The HOA responded exactly the way my attorney predicted. They tried to bury us. Boxes of documents arrived by the dozens. Old landscaping invoices, meeting minutes that had nothing to do with snow removal, duplicate files, outdated reports. It was an avalanche of paper meant to exhaust us and obscure the truth. But the tactic backfired because hidden in that mess were their own words. One email, in particular, changed everything. It was short, casual, sent from Linda to the snow removal contractor after one of my warning emails. "Dump it there," it read. "He complains too much anyway." When my attorney read it, he didn't react right away. He just looked up at me and nodded once. We both knew what that email meant. It showed intent, not an accident. Not confusion, a decision. That email became the center of the case. Once it was flagged, everything accelerated. Insurance companies that had been cautious suddenly became very interested. Adjusters requested copies of the engineer's report, the county inspection notice, and the internal emails. Their questions shifted from "what happened" to "who approved this?" Neighbors who had stayed quiet began reaching out. One admitted the board had warned them not to contradict the HOA publicly. Another said they were told flooding claims would be denied if they made trouble. Several were willing to testify about what they were told and what they personally witnessed during snow removal. Then the contractor spoke. Under oath, he testified that the HOA explicitly instructed his crew where to dump the snow. He confirmed the drainage channel was pointed out during a walkthrough. He admitted he raised concerns about compaction and runoff, but was told to follow the board's direction. The approval, he said, came from Linda. At that point, the board started to unravel. Emergency meetings were scheduled and then abruptly canceled. Emails from Linda became frantic, asking attorneys for reassurance and updates. Homeowners demanded explanations during open forums. The narrative the HOA had pushed for months couldn't survive exposure. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused, because what was happening wasn't revenge. It was accountability finally catching up. The HOA had operated for years, assuming no one would question them, no one would dig, and no one would push back hard enough to matter. Now they were facing insurers, attorneys, regulators, and a community that was starting to understand just how close it had come to a much larger disaster. For the first time since the flooding, the power dynamic had fully shifted. The HOA wasn't controlling the story anymore. The evidence was. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom at first. It happened in the community clubhouse, a room that had hosted holiday potlucks and casual meetings for years, but that night felt completely different. The air was tight. Every chair was filled. People stood along the walls and near the doors, arms crossed, faces tense. Conversations stopped when the board members walked in. Toward the back of the room, two insurance representatives sat quietly with notebooks open, observing everything. That alone told me how serious this had become. Insurance companies don't show up unless they're worried. At the front table sat the HOA board. Linda was in the center. She looked smaller than I remembered, paler. Her posture was stiff, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The confidence she used to carry like armor wasn't there anymore. When my attorney stood, The room went silent. He didn't start with accusations. He started with facts, calmly, methodically. He displayed a diagram of the neighborhood slope and traced the natural flow of meltwater with his finger. Then he overlaid photos taken before the flooding, showing snow compacted directly into the drainage channel. He followed that with the inspection records, or more accurately, the lack of them. 3 years without required seasonal inspections. People shifted in their seats. Someone whispered, 3 years? Then came the emails. My attorney read excerpts aloud. My warnings. The dismissive replies. And finally, the message everyone would remember. Dump it there. He complains too much anyway. He stopped reading. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Linda stared down at the table. One of the insurance representatives slowly closed their notebook, as if they'd just reached a conclusion. Next, the county inspector testified. He spoke evenly, without emotion, explaining what the drainage channel was designed to do and why blocking it was dangerous. He described the environmental runoff regulations tied to hillside developments and confirmed that the HOA had violated them. He explained how hydrostatic pressure builds behind a blockage and how the retaining wall failure was consistent with that pressure being redirected sideways. When he finished, one of the board members tried to jump in. He started talking about intentions, about how no one meant for damage to happen, about misunderstandings. The judge shut him down immediately. This is not argument, he said. This is testimony. That moment landed hard. The board wasn't running the meeting anymore. They weren't steering the conversation. They were reacting. As the hearing continued, more details surfaced. The snow removal contractor confirmed again that the HOA had directed where snow should be dumped. He stated clearly that the drainage channel had been pointed out during planning and that concerns about compaction were raised and dismissed. Neighbors spoke next. One described being told not to contradict the HOA if she wanted her insurance claim processed smoothly. Another admitted the board blamed me directly during a closed session. Each account chipped away at the image the HOA had tried to maintain. Linda was given a chance to speak. She kept it brief. She talked about leadership being difficult, about decisions made under pressure, about how hindsight made things clearer. She never addressed the email directly. She never denied signing off on the snow removal map. She didn't apologize. By the time the session ended, the outcome wasn't official yet, but it was obvious. The insurance representatives gathered their things quietly and left without speaking to the board. Homeowners lingered, talking in low voices, connecting dots they hadn't seen before. Several people avoided Linda's eyes as they passed. I walked out of the clubhouse into the cold night air and stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. For months, the HOA had tried to paint me as difficult, emotional, unreasonable. But in that room, under scrutiny, with documents and testimony laid out in order, the truth had spoken for itself. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. And for the first time since this began, the HOA wasn't in control of what happened next. The ruling didn't arrive with drama. There was no crowded room, no raised voices, no moment where everyone held their breath waiting for a reaction. It came quietly, delivered in writing, stamped and signed. But the impact was immediate and unmistakable. The HOA was found fully responsible. There was no shared fault assigned to homeowners, no vague language about misunderstandings or poor communication. The decision stated plainly that the flooding, property damage, and structural failures were the direct result of the HOA's actions. Their failure to perform required seasonal inspections, their decision to block a regulated drainage channel, and their attempt to shift blame after the damage occurred were all laid out in clear, methodical detail. They were ordered to pay for everything: repairs to my basement, the collapsed retaining wall, the damage to the 2 downhill homes, engineering fees, legal costs, county fines tied to environmental runoff violations. Every category was itemized. Deadlines were attached. There was no room left to argue. Then came the part no one on the board had prepared for. Linda was personally cited. The ruling referenced her signature on the snow removal plan and her direct instructions to the contractor. It noted that she had knowingly approved dumping in a restricted zone after being warned of the risk. The language didn't accuse her of malice, but it didn't need to. It described a pattern of willful disregard for established safety rules. That distinction mattered. It meant the consequences didn't end with the HOA as a corporation. Linda resigned the same week the ruling became public. There was no explanation, no goodbye message, no attempt to defend herself. Just a brief notice sent to homeowners stating she was stepping down effective immediately. After years of confidence and control, she was gone without ceremony. The fallout didn't stop there. Insurance companies reviewed the ruling and reacted fast. The HOA's risk classification changed overnight. Premiums tripled. Deductibles skyrocketed. One carrier refused to renew coverage at all. Emergency meetings were called as the board scrambled to understand how they would even afford to operate under the new terms. Homeowners were furious. Questions poured in. People demanded to know how decisions like this had been made without oversight. Special assessments were discussed and immediately met with backlash. The same board that once dismissed concerns now struggled to explain itself. I watched it all from a distance, not with celebration, but with a sense of finality. For months, I had been labeled the problem, a complainer, someone making things difficult. Now the same documents I had sent in warnings were being quoted back to the board by attorneys and regulators. Neighbors began reaching out again, this time with apologies instead of suspicion. Some admitted they had believed the HOA's version at first. Others said they had felt something was wrong but didn't think pushing back would matter. A few thanked me quietly for not backing down when it would have been easier to accept the blame. Repairs began almost immediately. Crews cleared the drainage channel properly. Engineers rebuilt the retaining wall to specification. The county inspected everything multiple times before signing off. This time, nothing was rushed, nothing was ignored. Standing in my backyard weeks later, watching water flow freely through the restored channel, I felt the weight finally lift. The damage was being repaired, but more importantly, the truth had been acknowledged. Poetic justice doesn't always come with shouting or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of accountability that can't be dodged or denied. The HOA believed authority was enough to override reality. They learned, the hard way, that it isn't. Once the ruling was finalized, everything moved fast, not because the HOA suddenly became responsible, but because they were under a microscope. The county imposed strict deadlines, and inspectors made it clear there would be no extensions and no excuses this time. Any delay would trigger additional penalties, and everyone on the board understood that. The drainage channel was rebuilt properly from the ground up. Crews removed every trace of compacted snow, ice, and debris. Engineers regraded the slope around it, reinforced the banks, and installed additional safeguards to ensure it could never be blocked again without immediate detection. Multiple inspections followed, each one documented and signed off before the next phase was allowed to begin. For the first time since I'd lived there, the system functioned exactly as it was designed to. The HOA was forced to change how it operated. Snow removal rules were rewritten in plain language, clearly defining restricted zones and mandatory inspection schedules. Any deviation now required written approval from licensed professionals and disclosure to homeowners. Maintenance plans were no longer handled quietly between board members. They were published, reviewed, and debated openly. Transparency wasn't optional anymore. It was enforced. The board itself changed just as dramatically. Several members resigned in the months that followed, unwilling to face ongoing scrutiny from homeowners. Early elections were held, and a new board took over. They weren't perfect, but they were cautious. They asked questions. They consulted experts. And when they didn't know something, they admitted it instead of pretending otherwise. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors who had avoided me during the worst of the dispute started reaching out. Some apologized for believing the board's version of events. Others thanked me for standing my ground when it would have been easier to give up. One family whose basement had flooded told me they never would have recovered the full truth if I hadn't kept pushing. Repairs to my home were completed slowly but thoroughly. The basement was restored, the retaining wall rebuilt stronger than before, and the landscaping repaired. It took months, but eventually my house stopped feeling like a reminder of everything that went wrong. As spring turned into summer, normal life returned in quiet ways. Kids played outside again. Neighbors waved when they passed. Conversations didn't drop into whispers. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood finally lifted. Standing in my backyard during a steady rain, watching water flow cleanly through the rebuilt channel, I felt closure settle in. The HOA had learned a lesson they couldn't undo. Cutting corners doesn't save money, it only delays the cost and multiplies it later. Peace returned not because anyone won, but because accountability finally arrived and stayed. Looking back on everything that happened, what still stands out to me isn't that the HOA made a mistake. People make mistakes all the time. What's hard to understand is that they were warned clearly, repeatedly, and in writing, and still chose arrogance over responsibility. They didn't just ignore the risk, they dismissed it, documented that dismissal, and then tried to punish the person who spoke up. This entire situation could have been avoided with one simple choice: respect how the world actually works. Water doesn't care about titles. Snow doesn't follow board votes. Gravity doesn't negotiate. Reality always wins, whether people acknowledge it or not. I never set out to fight my HOA. I didn't want meetings, lawyers, or months of stress. All I wanted was for a safety system to be left alone so it could do the job it was designed to do. When that system failed, I refused to accept blame for a disaster I had warned about from the very beginning. If there's one lesson I hope this story leaves behind, it's this: document everything. Ask questions. Trust what you know when the facts are on your side. Intimidation only works when people stay silent, and silence is often the most expensive choice you can make. In the end, the damage was repaired, the truth came out, and the neighborhood moved forward wiser than before. Peace didn't come from winning an argument. It came from accountability finally catching up. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?